I've been practicing psychiatry for 38 years. I love my job, my peers, and my patients. But I've come to the conclusion that I'm participating in the biggest intellectual scam of this era. We claim to be a science, but have no understanding how thought or behavior is generated. Many billions of dollars are spent each year in an industry built on a corrupt body of pseudoscience, cultivated and exploited by moneyed interests for decades. This scientific fraud has been more successful than any other of our day. Our diagnoses are contrived by our guild, the APA, with the collaboration of moneyed interests, and are so unrelated to actual science that they are copyrighted and published to profit that organization. In the process of selling a corporatist, medication-oriented model of treatment, psychiatry has been stunningly successful in redefining what it means to be a human being. Meanwhile, 20 years of peak psychiatry has resulted in a 30% increase of suicide in the United States, and American psychiatry has absolutely nothing constructive to say about it. Critic of psychology R.D. Liang echoed the sentiments of many people today when he posited that mental illness in a sick society is a symptom of being unable to fit in with something that is itself pathological. Ted Kaczynski said much the same. The concept of mental health in our society is defined largely by the extent to which an individual behaves in accord with the needs of the system and does so without showing signs of stress. Psychiatry, therefore, tends to place the locus of responsibility for a given state of affairs in society onto the individual. The fault lies not with the elites who subject man to unconscionable stressors and increasing pressures, but instead it lies with the patient, whose behaviors are considered maladaptive. Maladaptive in relation to what? To the demands of society, of course, whatever they may be at a given time. In the term maladaptive, we can already see that the failure is solely that of the person to adapt to the climate. The question of whether the climate itself is problematic is largely ignored. In this way, psychiatry serves as the guardian for modern industrial society. Kaczynski knew this very well, but in theory, it could be the guardian of any pathological system. Psychiatry allows one to tolerate the intolerable. It numbs one to the abuse so that one has no reason nor motivation to react against it. The political role of psychiatry is therefore counter-revolutionary. It prevents the revolutionary change of a sick and unconscionable system. The goal of psychiatry is not to solve the underlying causes of psychopathology, but instead merely to treat the symptoms. So what is a mental illness? You might already be clued into the fact that there's something relative about it. The psychiatric standards for diagnosis are based on the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. The contents of the DSM are voted on by a small cartel of elite psychiatrists. In essence, a small group of ideological aristocrats gets to determine what constitutes mental illness. Mental illness is a social construct, and this is fundamentally not a very scientific process at all. The National Institute of Mental Health, NIM, is the lead U.S. government institution that funds research on mental illness, and psychiatrist Thomas Insel was the NIM director from 2002 to 2015. In 2013, Insel stated that the DSM's diagnostic categories lack validity, and he announced that, quote, NIM will be reorienting its research away from DSM categories. More recently, in his 2022 book, Healing, Insel stated, the DSM had created a common language, but much of that language had not been validated by science. Even more bluntly than Insel, the chair of the DSM-4 1994 task force, psychiatrist Alan Francis, stated in 2010 that, quote, there is no definition of a mental disorder. It's bullshit. I mean, you just can't define it. However, Francis argued in Gary Greenberg's 2013 book about the DSM-5, the Book of Woe, that these labels are still crucial to treatment, and he warned, quote, if you puncture that noble lie, you'll be doing a disservice to our patients. A lot of false beliefs help people cope with life. Just how unscientific is the DSM? Not only does it lack validity, DSM diagnoses lack reliability. The APA conducted field trials on its DSM-5 to assess the degree of agreement between clinicians diagnosing the same individuals. A standard statistic used to assess reliability is called kappa. A kappa value 0 means 0 agreement and 0 reliability. A kappa of 1.0 means perfect reliability, and a kappa of less than 0.59 is considered weak reliability. DSM-3 Task Force Chair Robert Spitzer had proclaimed with respect to assessing the reliability of the DSM that a kappa of less than 0.4 indicated poor agreement and 0.7 was only satisfactory. For the DSM-5 field trials, here, reported in the Book of Woe, is a sample of kappa results: 0.2 for generalized anxiety disorder, 0.32 for major depressive disorder, 0.41 for oppositional defiant disorder, and 0.46 for schizophrenia. If an instrument is either invalid or unreliable, it is not scientifically useful, and the DSM is neither valid nor reliable, and so it has no scientific value. Another leading psychiatrist, Michael First, text editor for the DSM-4, gives us a sense of how psychiatry at its highest levels thinks. Quote, "The good news about the DSM-5 is also the bad news," states First in the Book of Woe. The DSM-5 relies on categories that facilitate clinician communication but have no firm basis in reality. So I think it's an improvement, but it's also an acknowledgement that psychiatry, especially in its understanding of mental illness, is still in its infancy. The concept of mental illness is the underpinning of the therapeutic state, a term coined by Thomas Szasz. The therapeutic state is similar to the nanny state. However, rather than to rely on the use of force to accomplish enlightened despotism, it utilizes positive reinforcement, psychiatry, and pharmaceuticals to do so instead. The role of the therapeutic state is to treat mental illness, and mental illness is simply whatever deviates from the norm. Therapeutic interventions have two phases, Szasz wrote. One is to heal the sick, and the other is to control the wicked. Yet the standard for wickedness is always subjective and variable, and so the psychiatrist inherited from the Inquisition the task of quarantining society's dangerous elements. It was not a coincidence that, even decades after the word psychiatrist entered English in 1890, practitioners were often called alienists, derived from the French aliéné, meaning both alienated and insane. First, Szasz wrote, it was God and the priests who kept the unruly in check. Then came the totalitarian leader and his apologists, along with Freud and the psychoanalysts. We call those who hold unorthodox or undesirable opinions insane, mad, or even delusional, and we are absolutely sure about what constitutes reality, and therefore we also make ourselves arbiters of delusion. But how sure can we even be about this? There are times in our lives when we have been deeply convinced that something untrue was actually reality. Like all Americans, I was conditioned to believe in the tabula rasa of humanity and in the non-existence of race or of significant racial differences. For a large number of people, this is reality, and anything else is pathology or insanity, despite empirical evidence to the contrary. The language by which we navigate reason and madness highlights an important consideration, that our conception of madness is fundamentally subject to power, and that it's a means of control and of hegemony, as Foucault has argued. Psychiatry is an arm of power, and the concept of mental illness is mediated by that power. If you are not like everybody else, then you are abnormal. If you are abnormal, then you are sick. These three categories, not being like everybody else, not being normal, and being sick, are in fact very different, but have been reduced to the same thing. Let's take a short detour in order to emphasize the potential danger of psychiatric control. Racism has become a quote-unquote public health crisis. As Harvard has stated, since 2019, policymakers from more than 50 American municipalities and 3 states have formally highlighted racism as a public health crisis. And on September 3rd, 2020, Rep. Ayanna Pressley, Democrat from Massachusetts, introduced the Anti-Racism and Public Health Act in Congress. The medicalization of racism, or any ideology for that matter, is only a short step away from the psychiatric pathologization of that ideology. Medicalization implies that this idea pathogen is an illness that must be cured. and to be cured is for it to be eradicated. Throughout history, when a state wanted to get rid of a population or an ideology, or if it wanted to stop a revolution, it would use extinctionist language. What is the language of illness but extinctionist? Disease is impurity, and impurity is pathological. The disease must be cleansed. They must be purified. Now, maybe if you're watching this video, you're not particularly right-wing, so you think that racism is morally wrong, and so you wouldn't object to the state trying to go after it. But understand that no matter your point of view, it's potentially subject to medicalization and therefore to totalitarian control, extinctionism, and the dreaded cure. We could just as easily imagine a right-wing dictatorship medicalizing homosexuality, which this has actually occurred in the not-too-distant past, and we're all familiar with the moribund attempts to cure homosexuality, such as lobotomy, insulin-induced comas, and electroshock therapy, as well as conversion therapy. We have no reason to believe that the medicalization of ideology would be any different from this. It would amount to the extinction of some part of the population. Michel Foucault pointed out that biomedical control is the most thorough form of power available to the state, since it allows regulation of a person's internal character, of his thoughts. Keeping this in mind, let's examine some of the biomedical elements of racism or ethnocentrism. A couple of experiments have found associations between neurochemicals and ethnocentrism. A 2011 study, Dejoux et al., found a positive link between oxytocin and human ethnocentrism. And interestingly enough, there is a recent case of a racist, Mike Bremer, who was the leader of the Midwest faction of the now-defunct Identity Europa, turning away from the ethnocentric beliefs that he held after receiving a dose of MDMA during a medical experiment. All of this is voluntary right now, of course. People choose to participate in these studies, but there's no reason to suppose that as the power of the state waxes, quote-unquote treatments, foundational links between neurochemicals and ideology, will not become mandatory. We've already seen the state engage in mass mandatory medicalization just a couple of years ago, and many people complied with it as they were conditioned to. The state has also managed to mass medicate the water supply through fluoridation, and some experts have even proposed dosing the population with lithium through the water supply in an attempt to combat mood disorders. Theoretically, the possibilities of mass medication are kind of limitless. The road to totalitarianism becomes clear. What roadblock exists to prevent the medical elite from dosing the population with, say, MDMA in an effort to curb racism? Or what about mandatory injections? When we take all of this evidence together, it demonstrates how thoroughly it's possible for psychiatric power to mold a person's beliefs, principles, and opinions, and fundamentally to take such a stranglehold on discourse and speech as has never before been possible. Even the punishment of pre-crime or thought crime, as in 1984 or Minority Report, becomes possible. All it takes for this to become a coercive reality is for psychiatrists at the DSM to declare that racism or any other political belief is a mental disorder, which then justifies a cure, an extinction of that political belief. The path to this is pretty obvious. In a society where a racist is a persona non grata, holding racist beliefs will cause distress and will therefore be maladaptive. If racism is already a public health crisis, then won't it be the next mental health crisis? The truth is that the psychiatric is inextricable from the political, and therefore it is also inextricable from social control. Now, in the Soviet Union, the political was indeed medicalized in such a way, and was even used to justify the internment of political prisoners. Several people were forced into special political psychiatric wards for thought crimes, such as converting to Orthodox Christianity or disagreeing with the Soviet state curriculum. There, they were subject to medical torture until they relented in their opposition. As one Soviet psychiatrist said, "Your disease is dissent." Dissent is conceived of as a developmental abnormality or as a psychiatric aberration, not merely an acceptable difference in thought. As a psychiatrist told this convert to Christianity, "You see, Gennady Mikhailovich, everything that you just told us confirms us in the view that illness lies at the root of your conversion. Of course, you yourself cannot understand this, but you must have confidence in us. We are specialists. If you had grown up in a religious family or lived somewhere in the West, well, then we could have looked at your religiousness in another way. But you were educated in a Soviet school, and you were brought up in a family of non-believers. You are an educated person. I am ready even to admit that you know more about philosophy and religion than I do. And suddenly, wham, you're religious. It's very odd indeed, and it makes one wonder if some abnormal process were not already developing in you in your youth, which later on brought you to religion. We can also see that the notion of authority is invoked, a special problem which we will consider later. Authority is not always co-substantial with the truth, which is a fact that many people seem to ignore. Additionally, a mental illness was constructed over dissenting political opinions. Here, we can see that obsessive truth-seeking and having a beard are signs of dreadful psychological imbalance. In the conclusions of several psychiatric special expert diagnoses, it is possible to find such symptoms of psychiatric illness: an obsessive mania for truth-seeking, wears a beard, meticulousness of thought, and an insufficiently critical attitude toward the existing situation, considers the entry of Soviet troops into Czechoslovakia to have been aggression, thinks that he must devote his life to the ideal of communism. The Soviets did not send these political prisoners to regular asylums where they might have enjoyed a limited selection of protections and rights and at least a nominal oversight against abuses. For these thought criminals, their alleged insanity warranted far worse. They were sent to special militarized asylums and outright denied any rights or autonomy. They were even forbidden legal recourse against abuses. Inside these medical facilities, dissidents were injected with a random assortment of dangerous drugs. This can only be construed as punishment, lobotomy by any other name. Inmates of psychiatric hospitals and their relatives have no say in the selection of the psychiatrist in charge of their case, nor can they question his decisions as to the treatment or even see the psychiatric reports on which these decisions are based. This opens the way for the most arbitrary and dangerous practices, whether impelled by official decision to suppress troublesome individuals by medical means or anxious to supply their own pet theories of diagnosis and treatment. Doctors have without medical justification inflicted on many inmates courses of injections with such drugs as aminazine, sulfazine, tryptazine, haloperidol, and insulin, often with disastrous results for patients not genuinely suffering from the condition for the treatment of which the drugs are intended. Leonid Pleshich, after being injected for months with alternatively or in series insulin, haloperidol, and tryptazine, lost his capacity to read or write letters and developed massive edemic swelling and a heart condition. Confinement was indefinite and lasted until the dissident was sufficiently demoralized and brainwashed. One doctor said to quote-unquote patient Victor Feinberg, "Your discharge depends on your conduct. By your conduct, we mean your opinions precisely on political questions. Your disease is dissent. As soon as you renounce your opinions and adopt the correct point of view, we'll let you out." Psychiatric abuse continues to this day in modern Russia. Regular old political oppression remains a fixture, but psychiatric confinement is also used to punish escaped orphans. Here are several examples available on Wikipedia. 2012, Nadezhda Nizhovkina and Vera Lavrashina were detained during their protest action at the Red Square. After Nizhovkina refused to write an application that she is sorry for what she has been doing at Red Square, she was convicted to involuntary hospitalization in psychiatric hospital for 6 months. Nizhovkina was hospitalized in Ganushkina Psychiatric Hospital, and her hospitalization was ruled legal by Moscow's Preobrazhensky District Court. On the doctor's request, her mother assumed responsibility for her by signing documents and was permitted to take her from the hospital. There were also no reasons for the involuntary inpatient treatment of Andrei Novikov, a journalist imprisoned on charges of extremism, and we should pay very close attention to this fact, and he was sent to involuntary psychiatric treatment after he publicly criticized Vladimir Putin's policy in Chechnya. Impartial legal proceedings would not have found formal components of a crime in the charges brought against Novikov, but his old psychiatric diagnoses, along with the expansive interpretation of the concept of danger as the reason of his involuntary hospitalization, allowed to solve his case in the way most convenient for authorities. There are cases when the motive for the unfounded psychiatric hospitalization was the intention of the administration of an orphanage to punish its inmates for their runaways and disobedience. During many involuntary hospitalizations in recent years, the staff of psychiatric hospitals did not follow the mandatory judicial procedure provided by the law. In 2009, several orphans from the city of Kimovsk in Tula Oblast ran away from their orphanage to a local priest. They told that they were sent to a psychiatric hospital through the explanation of their teachers, quote, for disobedience and the edification of others. The expert report from the Serbsky Center for Forensic Psychiatry showed that they were mentally healthy. In 2010, 20 out of 72 orphans from an orphanage in Komsomolsk-on-Amur was placed in a psychiatric hospital and exposed to neuroleptic medication. The city prosecutor found that all the children were placed in the hospital to be treated for emotional disorders without having been examined by a commission of psychiatrists or provided for by a court judgment. The children told that they had been warned that they would be sent to a madhouse because of their bad behavior. In the Raban of Sofino in Moscow Oblast from 2008 to 2011, psychiatric hospitalizations and treatments have been imposed on 23 of 46 inmates who reside in a local orphanage. In March 2011, the St. Petersburg Commissioner for Child Rights, Svetlana Agapitova, reported on the hospitalization of 4 orphans from the orphanage number 19 as a punishment for their disobedience. The medical records of the children did not contain notes of these hospitalizations. It is significant that none of the cases has reached a trial and entailed real convictions. All taken measures were limited to the prosecutor's investigation. According to some estimates, a psychiatric diagnosis is given to half of all children who live in state institutions. Infant orphans who come of age and receive a diagnosis in a psychiatric hospital are sent to psychoneurological internats without asking their consent. There a new problem arises. Quite legally capable people cannot get out of there, work, start their family, and live a normal life. Even voicing displeasure at government corruption is a mental disorder in Russia. In 2004, Igor Molyakov was imprisoned on libel charges for 6 months. While imprisoned, he was ordered committed for hospitalization to a psychiatric hospital after government lawyers persuaded a judge that Molyakov expressed in his writings about corruption among local authorities a view so somber that it might be regarded as a mental disorder. Now that we've gone over all of these cases of psychiatric abuse, it's time to address the problem of authority and the authoritarian view of knowledge. Simply because something is backed by authority and reinforced by individuals with a long list of credentials does not mean that it is true, ethical, nor just. A lot of the psychiatric apparatus is indeed justified by the fact that a lot of these people have expertise and we're supposed to defer to their opinions, but is it really so clear-cut? Ryan Falk made an excellent series of videos on the authoritarian view of knowledge called TLAU. People tend to conflate authority with truth, intelligence, or expertise, when in reality, a disinterested layman may be better prepared to have an unbiased look at the evidence. Ryan shows that laymen are actually better than experts at making predictions, that advanced degrees do not predict extremely high intelligence, that laymen can interpret scientific studies with accuracy and sufficient experience, and that experts often forget nearly everything they've learned in higher education, as well as much else. Additionally, the idea that scientific data is often highly rigorous is a misconception. Several sting studies have shown that highly acclaimed journals often miss outright fraudulent studies, while lesser-known journals are more likely to catch them. And there is also a replicability crisis in several fields, including psychiatry, which is one of the worst. The myth that experts are these exalted beings with a special ability to access the truth is nonsense. In addition to all this, neither are scientists aloof and disinterested beings. Scientists do not exist in a vacuum. They are subject to social control, to social and economic incentives, and other forces that might bias their thinking and research. To sum it all up, authority does not guarantee that a person or an institution is making correct judgments, and therefore, we should have no reason to privilege an expert's opinion about this or that idea, thought, or behavior, such as the members of the council that decides on mental disorders and the DSM. Experts should be put under extreme criticism precisely because of the power they hold over the opinions of the public. This brings us to the concept of mental illness. Now, I won't deny that something called mental illness exists. I'm not going to go as far as Thomas Saz does and say that what appears as mental illness are simply unverifiable problems of living. The fact is, there is some scientific evidence that verifies the existence of mental disorders. Plenty of studies verify the heritability of depression, schizophrenia, general anxiety disorder, and so on. There are even GWAS studies that show correlations for these things, but I just want to point out that the way in which mental illness is defined, which is basically an arbitrary choice by a merchants guild called the APA, is quite subject to abuse, even if they may or may not get some things correct. And furthermore, the picture of mental illness presented to the public is often just flat out wrong in a lot of ways, and it has ramifications on the way we view treatments and psychiatry as a whole. You might have this preconceived idea that we can point to physical evidence in the brain to verify the existence of mental illnesses, that mental illnesses are exactly like physical illnesses, and so they could be easily treated with medical intervention. But this question is in reality quite complicated. One example is that of addiction. The way addictions map on fMRI scans is sort of all over the place. Mental illnesses involve several areas of the brain and seem to not really have any consistency. Alcohol addiction and drug addiction, even across different instances and different individuals, map to different parts of the brain and show different patterns. To prove that there is a specific physical pattern or brain activity called addiction is in reality quite difficult, and therefore, since addiction is so psychophysiologically complex, it seems impossible to come up with a single knockout therapeutic intervention. The cure for a broken leg is somewhat invariable, and it's pretty obvious. You do surgery if it's necessary, and then you treat it with immobilization. The problem is easily verified and very simple. Mental illnesses are not so simple. Depression, for example, is a very neurologically complex phenomenon, just like addiction. The medical model is a nice just so story that depression is a chemical imbalance in the brain that can be treated with a pill. You might think that we have definitively found the neurophysiological cause of depression. We haven't. The prevailing view of depression is the serotonin theory, that depression is caused by low levels of serotonin in the brain. However, despite the absolute reliance of the psychiatric establishment on this view, there is no conclusive empirical evidence for it. Moncrief et al. 2022 found no relationship between depression and serotonin levels. Additionally, the typical pharmacological treatment for depression, serotonin reuptake inhibitors or SSRIs, are only slightly more effective than placebo. And, not to mention, unlike a placebo, SSRIs can have seriously harmful side effects, including a worsening of depression and suicidality, flattening of emotions, psychosis, loss of libido, and mania. Irving Kirsch published a meta-analysis proving that antidepressants in general are no better than a placebo. Quote, all antidepressants, including the well-known SSRIs, had no clinically significant benefit over a placebo. Moreover, drug companies are not required to do long-term outcome studies to acquire FDA approval. The FDA's major depressive disorder, developing drugs for treatment guidance for industry, states the following. Antidepressants in established classes, e.g. SSRIs, SNRIs, typically need studies of 6 to 8 weeks duration to demonstrate efficacy. Thus, the general public is unaware of studies that show antidepressants over the long term may result in more, not less, depression. In 2017, poorer long-term outcomes among persons with major depressive disorder treated with medication, published in Psychotherapy and Psychosomatics, reported that after controlling for depression severity, the outcomes of 3,294 subjects over a 9-year period showed that antidepressants may have had an immediate short-term benefit for some people, but at the 9-year follow-up, antidepressant users had significantly more severe symptoms than those individuals not using antidepressants. Additionally, a lot of negative evidence that contraindicates the use of SSRIs gets buried and unpublished. For some reason, we are prescribing to depressed people a drug that can cause depression. Nonetheless, there is a ton of authority behind the serotonin theory and the employment of SSRIs, and the vast majority of the public has since retained the false belief that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance. Pharmaceutical journalism states, according to the researchers, as many as 85 to 90% of the public believe that depression is caused by low serotonin or a chemical imbalance. Our view is that patients should not be told that depression is caused by low serotonin or by a chemical imbalance, that they should not be led to believe that antidepressants work by targeting these unproven abnormalities, said Joanna Moncrief, whose study I just mentioned, a consultant psychiatrist and the lead author in a press release accompanying the study. We do not understand what antidepressants are doing to the brain exactly, and giving people this sort of misinformation prevents them from making an informed decision about whether to take antidepressants or not. All in all, it appears that not only have we failed to fully justify the medicalization of mental illness through an empirical lens, but pharmacological intervention may have actually done more harm than good. It's worth noting that mental illness itself is fundamentally a social construct. Yes, it's sometimes informed by evidence, but its precise parameters are completely arbitrary and voted on by a cabal of experts at the DSM, who are humans subject to social and economic pressure. One concrete example of this is the fact that homosexuality was, for at least a couple of decades, included under the DSM as a mental disorder and specifically as a deviancy disorder. The DSM shows its hand immediately by considering deviancy to be a disorder ipso facto, despite there being nothing necessarily pathological about deviance. Dr. Edward Shorter, writing for the AMA Journal of Ethics, has observed much the same about the DSM. Psychiatry's meddlesomeness in sexual behavior has a long history. There was a time when medicine, an inherently conservative field, opposed many kinds of sexual expression on the grounds that they induced hysteria in women or neurasthenia in men. Masturbation, for example, was seen as deeply pathological. Foremost in the assault upon sexual expression was Vienna psychiatry professor Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who wrote in Psychopathia Sexualis, 1886, not only opposed homosexuality and fetishism, but linked them to a genetic degeneration. Those who took part in unapproved sexual activities were said to be born degenerate and to pass the bad seed onto their children. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, had a similar horror of many kinds of sexuality. He believed that masturbation caused neurasthenia and that paranoia arose as a result of sexual developments in early childhood. It was against this background of European hostility to certain forms of sexual expression that U.S. psychiatry took over global leadership of the field after the Second World War. In psychiatry, the major American leadership instrument was the above-mentioned Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. American psychiatry has notably failed to make a distinction between atypical sexual interest and harmful treatment of other people, whether that be a violation like rape or merely subtle coercion, grouping together such disparate ideas as sexual assault and attraction to people of the same sex under the general banner of mental disorders. The DSM-1 quickly dispatched what it called sexual deviation. The diagnosis will specify the type of the pathologic behavior, such as homosexuality, transvestism, pedophilia, fetishism, and sexual sadism. Thus, from the get-go, two major areas of human sexuality were declared off-limits: attraction to people of the same sex, and what is today called non-vanilla sexuality, or kink. The DSM-1 also declared rape, sexual assault, and mutilation to be part of sexual sadism, thus completely conflating the innocuous, for example, the people who like to dress up on the Saturday afternoon and play domination submission in bed, with the terrible. The DSM-2, in 1968, expanded the range of sexual deviation to include exhibitionism and voyeurism, alongside fetishism and homosexuality. The second edition manual helpfully explained that it considered sexually deviant those individuals whose sexual interests are directed primarily toward objects other than people of the opposite sex, or towards bizarre sex, such as sexual sadism and fetishism. Obviously, the concept of mental illness and sexual deviancy was simply a reflection of the prevailing socio-cultural view of sexuality, which was uninformed by evidence. The very fact that homosexuality could be pathologized per se indicates that the concept of mental illness as we conceive of it today is a mere construct formed by the prevailing normative view. This was and will continue to be the case no matter how you feel about homosexuality or any other kind of sexual deviancy. What matters is that mental illness is fundamentally a pathologization of deviation itself, no matter what that deviation is or how justified it might be. When deviation from institutional lies becomes a duty for us, we will very quickly see those lies reified as normal. First they came for the gays, but tomorrow they will come for the racists. The very fact that the DSM's conception of mental illness is designed to punish any behavioral or ideological deviation is really what matters here, not necessarily the content itself. The history of psychiatry's encounter with sexual diagnoses calls into question the role of psychiatrists as society's moral gatekeepers, one for which the studies of histocytes in the medical school poorly qualifies them. The history of the DSM's otherworldly, judgmental, and completely unscientific approach to sex would seem risible if the consequences in the real world of making behavior into medical diagnoses were not so serious. Now, I want to call attention to an objection that someone might make of my criticism of psychiatry as a system of control. It might go something like, the issue is not necessarily with the system of control, but rather with the ideological content behind the norms we use it to enforce. Obviously, I don't share Foucault and the post-structuralist insistence on absolute human autonomy or sexual liberation. I am a Christian authoritarian, so I have no issue with systems of control per se, but nevertheless, I am against totalitarianism. I believe in a basic central human dignity derived from the Christian belief in the inherent value of the human soul. To subject a man to an absolute crushing of his autonomy is just as serious a wrong as to give him complete free rein to do whatever he wants, whether his actions are moral or immoral. The Bible gives us a clear vibe, to borrow Bronski's expression, of human freedom. Man was freed from the strict law of the Old Testament, and he has been given even greater control over the use of his free will as long as he doesn't sin. This should set the general tone for a Christian society. This freedom comes in contrast to the repression of Nero, to the iron fist of Rome. Christianity positions itself both as a religion of liberation and salvation, and so a Christian society must come to respect that. Now, my specific objection to the psychiatric system of control is the fact that, unlike physical discipline, propaganda, the rule of law, or other systems, it is extremely invasive, allowing not just indirect control of a person's behavior, but rather direct pharmaceutical and even transhumanist totalitarianism. In fact, its very end is total control, as Foucault has argued. The ability to predict whether an individual will commit a crime and to punish him on that basis simply cannot exist without the ability to read minds and without the ability to do what psychologists might call a risk assessment. Pre-crime and psychiatry are necessary partners, and if we consider what the teleological end of biomedical control is, again, it is totalitarianism. Genetic engineering, brain-computer interfaces, microchipping, pharmaceuticals, all of these things do not present even the slightest security gap that would allow the expression of righteous dissent. Even in prisons, there exist forms of rebellion, such as riots and the hunger strike. But what rebellion can a cyborg engage in, or a genetically modified human engage in, who has been completely engineered out of any conservative beliefs, when all of his behavior has been centrally controlled by the state? Totalitarianism becomes inevitable, and there is no way out. Biomedical control, which is sort of the broader category that psychiatry fits into, is unique in its propensity. The end of a system of laws and punishments is not necessarily the total utilization of those things, because they are fundamentally subject to human interpretation and decision-making, to the political. Whereas, as Jacques Ellul has argued, the end of technique is its maximal utilization and the replacement of humanity. Technology becomes therefore post-political. The technological singularity is such a danger to qualified freedom that we absolutely must treat it as a unique evil, as a system of control. Another important point of contention about psychiatry is its mystification of the mind. The public has an image of psychiatry as an empirical science akin in rigor and in specificity to biological medicine, yet figures like Sigmund Freud, who believed that the origin of human sexuality was the desire to have sex with one's own mother or father, continue to remain mainstays of psychiatric discourse. Freudian psychoanalysis, as Kevin MacDonald noted in Culture of Critique, has cultic elements. The psychoanalyst was shielded from criticism or questioning. If a patient questioned a psychoanalyst, it was considered to be a sign of pathology. So the psychoanalyst essentially got to speak ex cathedra, like the Pope. The way academic discourse functioned during this era was also quasi-religious. Often people would withhold opinions until Freud or Jung spoke and gave their explicit approval. Anyone who diverged from the wisdom of the masters was ostracized from elite social circles and journals. We like to think that in the current decade we've grown past the pseudo-religious mythologies of Freud and Jung, but prominent clinical psychologists and psychiatrists like Jordan B. Peterson continue to pontificate about these theories as if they offer useful insight into the functioning of the psyche and therefore also into the treatment of mental illness. Freud and Jung continue to be taught in universities, and it appears that their legacies simply will not die. Even modern psychiatry itself is increasingly resembling a religion. The phrase mental health has been reified, and the way it's spoken of sounds almost like a revival movement. People, quote-unquote, believe in mental health. People support mental health. And what exactly does this even mean? Usually it seems to mean that people are uncritically approving of the wisdom of the psychiatric apparatus and the psychiatric masters. And also it seems to manifest in the false belief that psychiatry can cure mental disorders, when in reality we know that it merely treats them. Psychotherapy is one of the most obvious examples. People who undertake therapy need it on a continuous basis. If it were really an effective cure for mental disorders, then patients would not need to continue to persist in therapy sessions for 10 or 20 years or for their whole life. Even then, experiences with therapy are not universally positive, and the way in which certain disorders are often treated by therapists, such as depression and autism, can raise some ethical questions. People have critiqued the psychotherapeutic view of depression as a false view of reality. There is as much reason to suppose that pessimism is a valid view as optimism. Is it not, after all, rational that a person would become depressed after being exposed to trauma and after experiencing the worst that the world has to offer? And yet, the overwhelming therapeutic approach to depression treats the patient as if he has a warped view of reality, and that his depression is fundamentally irrational. To this end, some therapists will even attempt to convince the patient to engage in self-deception about his situation. Is it really ethical to tell people polite lies or to gaslight your client? The course that psychotherapy has taken for autistic people is even worse. A predominant paradigm in autism, which is shared by the organization Autism Speaks, is that it ought to be cured, that there is something fundamentally wrong with someone who is autistic simply because he's neurodivergent. You might recall that the DSM's diagnosis of mental disorder often is contingent upon the fact that it simply diverges from some normal standard of behavior. Now, a very controversial form of therapy called ABA seeks to use behavioral conditioning in order to get autistic children to mimic normal behaviors. Abusive methods are used, such as punishments, as well as forced ignoring and social deprivation, in order to shape the desired behavior in their clients. The founder of ABA remarked that autistic people are barely human and that they are simply lumps of clay to be molded. What emerges as salient in ABA is the desire for control, to enforce at any cost normal behavior, even if it is to the detriment of the client's well-being, and even if it conflicts with that client's psychological nature. To cure autism with ABA is about as effective as to attempt to cure homosexuality with aversion therapy. It's kind of the same thing, and yet ABA continues to have its exponents and practitioners. This is all the result of the medicalization of the mind. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder that has some genetic and environmental causes, but it isn't the same as a broken leg. To cure autism in a human is utterly impossible, and all attempts to do so are moribund. An autistic child cannot be cured of autism any more than a leopard can be cured of its spots. Pharmacological techniques simply cannot alter the brain's neurophysiology, and so autism, which is a form of altered neurophysiology, cannot be cured by intervention. It's like saying that we can cure brain damage or fetal alcohol syndrome with a pill. That obviously can't happen. The result of medicalizing autism has therefore been to pathologize it, and since pathologies need to be cured, the psychiatric approach to autism has been entirely extinctionist. It's notable that part of the research that Autism Speaks funds is research into early detection of autism in the womb. The implication is that it might allow parents to abort the child if they know that he will have autism, and so medicalization gives way to a form of genocide. This is what you're supporting when you uncritically say that you believe in mental health. The mystification of the mind reaches its terminal point when we consider the predominance of New Age spiritual techniques in modern psychiatry. The source of this phenomenon, as Christopher Lasch has noted, was in the rise of movements dedicated to self-exploration in the 60s and 70s. Psychiatrists became interested in the potential of psychedelic drugs to treat mental disorders, as well as to aid in the exploration into the properties of the psyche. Over time, the New Age movement and psychiatry would merge together, resulting in psychiatrists recommending, unironically, the practice of yoga and mindfulness meditation. It seems harmless enough on the surface, however, it's been known for centuries by Buddhists that meditation can actually have some very negative consequences. There are enough anecdotes about psychotic episodes caused by meditation, as well as dissociation, But further, Buddhists have coined a certain negative psychospiritual experience they call falling into the pit of the void. Practitioners of meditation describe crippling depression, existential dread, and even suicidality. Being well outside of their area of expertise, psychiatrists nevertheless continue to recommend meditation, even though there is little empirical study of its negative consequences. Probably the most religious dimension of modern psychiatry is its affirming approach to gender dysphoria, which is what we might call gender ideology. Helen Joyce has noted that the modern psychiatric approach to transgenderism almost seems to revive the ancient idea of the third sex, or the sex of the soul, the idea that a woman can be born into a male body or vice versa. There is no biological evidence to substantiate this claim, and yet the whole of gender affirmative care is built around the idea that such a thing as a brain-body mismatch can occur, that the only treatment is to alter the body. Such an approach is unheard of in other disorders, such as bodily integrity disorder, which is considered a delusional disorder. The treatment for BID is not to saw off the limb in question, but rather to treat the underlying delusion. But for some reason, the delusion that leads to gender dysphoria, the idea of being born into the wrong body, is instead fully endorsed by psychiatry, and it therefore escapes treatment or question. This is basically the cult of gender identity. Despite the existence of tons of evidence that transition is not an effective treatment for gender dysphoria, the psychiatric cult continues to recommend it with the force of moral authority. Increasingly, there are calls for children to transition and for parents to be completely uninvolved in the process. This raises the ethical problem of the fact that children do not have the informed ability to consent to such procedures, since they cannot understand the ramifications of the sterility that transition can cause, as well as the decline in libido and sexual function later in life. And yet, this mystified delusion persists in the establishment, and it is enforced by authority. Anyone who questions it is summarily excommunicated. The fact that such an abuse of truth and ethics can continue to exist in psychiatric so-called medicine is yet another testament to its flaws and to the danger of allowing the state biomedical control over the population. Ultimately, adherents to the mental health religion are carrying out a Mott and Bailey style argument. Their Mott, which is the sort of easy argument that you present to the public, which is non-extreme and unobjectionable, is that psychiatry is an empirically sound form of medicine that is an exact equivalent of the type of medicine of the physician or the surgeon. This, however, is untrue for the simple fact that abnormality in the brain is not necessarily pathological, whereas abnormality elsewhere in the body necessarily is pathological. An abnormal leg would make it impossible to live normally since it impedes walking and the navigation of terrain, but an abnormal brain, such as that of an autistic man, does not necessarily cause any impediment in living that is not simply a failure of society to accept or to tolerate his differences. He could still live a perfectly happy life, capable of performing any given mental task, despite having autism. And even then, to determine whether a brain is abnormal or not is not as easy a task as it is to determine if another body part is abnormal. We can easily determine that a broken leg is abnormal and also easily derive ipso facto that it is pathological. But what about the brain of a racist or of a conspiracy theorist? It's certainly not normal in society to be either of those things, but in this case, abnormality is not necessarily evidence of a pathology. The Bailey, which is sort of the extreme argument that proponents of psychiatry will retreat to, is that the psychiatric approach to defining pathology is basically just a series of social constructs voted on by a cabal, but it's perfectly fine because they're experts and it's all based on science trademark. And then we get the religious veneration of authority again, and it therefore loses all pretensions to be scientific. So let's do a quick thought experiment. Imagine that you wanted to create a problem-solving company, so you make money by solving other people's problems. If you're really good at it, you'll make more money, but the issue is, the better you get at it, the fewer problems there are to solve. In order to keep making money, you'd have to start creating problems to solve, or you'd have to start solving the problems very poorly. This might look like convincing people who don't have a problem that they actually do have a problem, or maybe you could start selling people bad solutions that cause the problem to continue recurring so you can sell more solutions like planned obsolescence. And maybe, just maybe, you might think about directly causing the problems yourself. This is exactly what the pharmacological industry does in capitalist countries. And the defense industry does this too, by the way. There's currently quite a bit of controversy over ADHD. Many claim that normal childhood hyperactivity is being pathologized and that the societal expectation that children, especially young boys, should simply sit down and be quiet during class is quite an unnatural one. In fact, the gender difference in ADHD diagnosis is a potential point of evidence in favor of this overdiagnosis hypothesis. Boys are much more hyperactive than girls, and the entirety of the public education system appears to be constructed around feminine norms: quietness, attentiveness, calmness, and conformity to rules. It's quite possible that normal masculine behavior is simply being pathologized and billed as a mental disorder, hence the fact that 3 times as many boys are diagnosed with ADHD than girls, according to Routledge 2010. One possibility may be that girls manifest ADHD differently from boys and that they simply exhibit an inattentive form of ADHD. However, if ADHD is simply a pathologization of normal behavior, as the critics argue, wouldn't this argument simply be begging the question? Perhaps the illness itself is just being constructed around the behavior of boys rather than that of girls. Rates of ADHD have been increasing since 1997, and concerns are being raised that children are being over-medicated. What percentage of these diagnoses are the result of raised awareness? Or does it actually reflect a true increase in the number of cases of ADHD? Or maybe it just denotes more stringent standards on student behavior. If the latter is true, and if the previously stated hypothesis is correct, then children are indeed being over-medicated, and it is a serious public health crisis. Who can pull the brakes on this if it's happening? The problem is there's no incentive for anyone to. The pharmaceutical and psychiatric apparatus both stand to profit from increased rates of diagnosis for any disorder. Perhaps the most blatant example of the medical-industrial complex in action is the gender affirmation pipeline. As I pointed out in my video on transgenderism, 80 to 90% of children with gender dysphoria will desist by the age of 18. However, there's a concerted effort by psychiatric professionals to get children on puberty blockers, which have irreversible side effects, which stunt sexual development, and which, as certain studies show, put children on a guaranteed path to transition. This is obviously unethical because these children are being given medical treatments that they don't necessarily need and which have negative consequences. But nonetheless, power is completely behind the idea of child transition. Medical practitioners stand a lot of money to gain by offering costly drugs and surgical procedures to transgender patients. Sexual reassignment surgery is notorious for complications, as I've already noted. The rate of complications is over 70%, and so patients will require additional surgical procedures to correct the problem over and over again. That's a lot of money, and it stands to make people a little, richer. Only in countries with state-funded socialized healthcare has there been any attempt to deter people from transitioning. Obviously, the reason behind this is because transitioning is expensive and would cost the state quite a bit of money. So unlike under capitalist conditions, there is actually an incentive to only provide medical care when it is absolutely necessary. The medical-industrial complex also may be behind the ascientific prescription of antidepressants to millions of people. We may also remember the thalidomide scandal, in which pharmaceutical corporations billed the drug as a safe treatment for morning sickness. However, it actually caused birth defects. The pharmaceutical industry has a lot to answer for, and it appears that the system of incentives that exists benefits companies at the expense of patients. Again, this is what you're supporting when you say, "I support mental health." It is capitalism with a bottle of pills, a groomer eager to sell you a solution. Finally, it's time to go through some of the dark history of psychiatry. The reason why I'm putting this at the end is so I don't poison the well. Obviously, we can't judge the entirety of modern psychiatry by its history any more than we can judge modern racial science by, let's say, phrenology. But nevertheless, the history of psychiatry tells us important lessons about its potential for abuse and what the motivations behind it often are. And the normativity of confinement remains in full force to this day, as I've already mentioned in the case of contemporary Russia, as it's still being used to punish political dissidents. It's a cliche axiom that those who do not understand history are doomed to repeat it. I think this is especially true in medicine. At several points in the trajectory of psychiatry, questionable treatments were employed in order to cure what they thought was pathological. The history of psychiatric intervention is a dark one, especially when these interventions were used against people forcibly committed to insane asylums. It is quite a shameful blot on the record of psychiatry and a reminder of what it can potentially be. Early medical interventions for psychiatric disorders included something as insane as malarial therapy, as well as insulin shock therapy and lobotomy. Lobotomy is perhaps the most shocking. It is a procedure in which part of the frontal lobe is removed surgically, which usually resulted in patients having impaired affect as well as intellectual function. It left many gravely disabled, and it completely destroyed their quality of life. The United States, like many other countries, utilized its mental health apparatus to pathologize homosexuality for decades. Many gays were seriously harmed by these quote-unquote treatments. For example, Walter Friedman lobotomized 3,439 homosexuals, leaving them utterly disabled. Insulin shock therapy was a technique typically administered to those who were forcibly committed to insane asylums. Insulin injections were used to induce multiple comas over several days, and it was seen as an effective treatment for schizophrenia. However, scientists would later write that there was no sound basis for the treatment at all. Insulin shock therapy has resulted in several deaths as well as severe brain damage. Suffice to say, it was not an ethical practice whatsoever, and it was effectively pseudoscience. Additionally, we might also include conversion therapy. As Julius Evola astutely observed, behaviorism is the American religion, and nothing proves this more than its insistence on methods of conditioning for solving behavioral abnormalities. I've already explained the unethical use of behavioral conditioning in an attempt to treat autism through ABA, but conditioning is used elsewhere and with about as much impact. Despite being unrecognized by the psychiatric establishment, conversion therapy still has its proponents, especially on the religious right. We should be careful to not treat my rejection of psychiatric abuse as license or approval of the sexual revolution or even as approval of sin. However, to oppose homosexuality is one thing, but to subject homosexuals to pointless torture is another. I find it perfectly valid to include attempts to treat homosexuality and various kinds of conversion therapy to be forms of psychiatric abuse, or alternatively, masochism, since some conflicted homosexuals will desperately seek a cure for their orientation. These methods do not work any better than idiot conversion therapy, also known as public school, and these therapies often result in guilt complexes, depression, disappointment, and self-hatred. The reason why it doesn't work is because there's a significant heritable component to homosexuality, and in all likelihood, even the environmental contribution is the result of differences in prenatal hormone levels, so thus even the environmental effects become fixed and unalterable and are mediated by genes. Sexual differentiation of the brain is caused by some combination of prenatal hormone exposure and differences in genome, and some studies have identified differences between homosexual and heterosexual men in brain morphology. One study was able to detect brain differences in utero. Panzica, GC, Este, and Vigiletti, Panzica, Cialdenzer, MA, 1995. A 1991 study by Simon LeVay found differences in the hypothalamus in homosexual men, which was more like the female hypothalamus. However, his findings were contradicted in Swab DF, Gore and LJ Hoffman MA 1992, who demonstrated that homosexuals actually often have larger hypothalami, which might be more consistent with the hypermasculinity theory of homosexuality. We also have some GWAS studies, that is, genome-wide association studies, on homosexual behavior, as well as studies on the heritability of male homosexuality. Male sexual orientation is moderately heritable, 30 to 40%, but is multifactorial, with evidence of multiple genetic and environmental contributions via family studies, twin studies, and segregation analyses. Sanders et al., 2017. In addition to all of these, some fringe theories exist, such as human chimerism or birth order effect. At any rate, it appears that the brains of homosexuals differentiate abnormally in the womb. Thus, when we consider environmental factors, there's no reason to suppose that sexuality is mutable by psychiatric technique. And really, there's no reason to suppose that any mental disorder is really mutable through behavioral conditioning. To use an analogy, if your mother drinks while you're in the womb, it's not like you can use therapy to fix your fetal alcohol syndrome. Much of behaviorist psychiatry relies on the same religious belief that humans are blank slates that can be infinitely altered through behavioral conditioning. No matter what the cultists think, this is simply not true. Subjecting people to pointless conditioning and discipline is a form of cruelty and abuse. It definitely does not benefit the patient in any way.